The Northwood Conservatory had a way of making people feel small. It wasn't just the high ceilings that seemed to swallow sound, or the portraits of stern, long-dead composers staring down from the gilded walls. It was the air itself, thick with the weight of 100 years of brilliant music and the pressure to create more. For most students, it was an exciting challenge, a place to prove their worth. For Alara, it was a place where she learned to become invisible. She moved through the hallways like a whisper. Her coat was a little worn at the cuffs, a detail she was painfully aware of whenever she stood near the other students in their crisp new jackets. Her shoes were polished with care each morning, but they weren't the expensive, sleek brands that seemed to be the uniform here. She was a scholarship student, a fact that felt like a brand on her forehead, even though no one ever said it out loud. It was in the way their eyes would slide past her, in the conversations that would pause for just a second when she walked by. She was a ghost in their world, a background element in the grand, dramatic painting of their lives. Her world was different. It didn't exist in the bustling cafeteria or the crowded common rooms. Her world was waiting for her in a small, soundproofed room on the third floor, tucked away at the end of a forgotten corridor. This was her sanctuary. During the day, she was quiet, reserved, almost clumsy. She would sit in her classes, her head bent over her notebooks, her hand flying across the page to capture every word the teacher said. She rarely raised her hand, even when she knew the answer. Speaking in front of all those confident, critical eyes felt like stepping onto a stage naked. A knot would form in her stomach, her throat would go dry, and the words would just die on her tongue. But at night, when the conservatory was empty and the only sounds were the creaks of the old building settling into sleep, Ilara would go to her sanctuary. She would unlock the door with the small, silver key she kept on a simple chain around her neck, and she would step inside. The room smelled of old wood and dust, a scent she found more comforting than any perfume. In the corner sat a upright piano, its black finish scarred and chipped from years of dedicated students. It wasn't a grand, gleaming instrument like the ones in the concert halls, but to Ilara it was perfect. She would sit on the worn wooden bench, her fingers hovering over the yellowed ivory keys, and then she would begin to play. In those moments, the quiet, awkward girl would disappear. Her fingers, which seemed so clumsy during the day, would come alive at night, dancing across the keys with a grace and power that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. The music was her voice. It was where she poured all the things she could never say. The frustration of feeling like an outsider, the joy of a beautiful sunset she'd seen from the bus window, the deep, lonely ache for a home that felt 1,000,000 miles away. The melodies would fill the small room, complex and emotional, sometimes soft and weeping, sometimes loud and raging. It was her secret, a beautiful, powerful secret that she kept locked away with the piano. Her music theory class was the worst part of her day. It was taught by Mr. Alistair Finch, a man whose reputation for sharp words and a sharper temper was known even to the freshmen. He was a brilliant musician, everyone said that, but he was also a man who seemed to enjoy making his students feel small. He would prowl the front of the classroom like a panther, his dark eyes scanning the rows of faces, always looking for someone to pounce on. He favored the students who were bold, the ones who came from wealthy families and had the confidence to match. He loved a good debate, a chance to show off his superior knowledge. He had no time for the quiet ones. To him, Ilara was just an empty chair. She would sit in the front row, her notebook open, her pen ready, but he never looked at her. His gaze would pass right over her as if she were made of glass. He would call on the others, praising a boy named Julian for his adequate, if uninspired, analysis of a chord progression, or tearing apart a girl's interpretation of a sonata with a few cutting, sarcastic remarks. Ilara would just sit there, her heart pounding, hoping to remain unnoticed. She would absorb everything, her mind a sponge, soaking up the technical details, the history, the theory. She understood it all, often more deeply than the students he praised, but she could never have said it. Not in his classroom, not in front of him. So she remained a ghost, a silent observer in the back of his mind. A name on his attendance list that he never called, a quiet presence in the room that he had decided, from the very first day, was not worth his time. and she was fine with that. Being invisible was safer than being seen. At least that's what she thought. The air in Mr. Finch's classroom was always thick, not just with the smell of old books and floor polish, but with a kind of nervous energy. It was a room where you held your breath. He stood at the front, a tall, thin man dressed in a suit that always looked a little too formal for a morning class. He was talking about Rachmaninoff, his voice a low, dramatic boom that filled every corner of the room. A picture of the composer was projected on the screen behind him, his face stern and serious, much like Mr. Finch himself. "It's not just notes on a page," Finch was saying, his hands clasped behind his back as he paced. "Anyone can learn to press the correct keys. A machine can do that. But this requires something more. It requires a soul. A Russian soul, full of angst and passion and a darkness that most of you, with your comfortable lives and your simple little joys, could never possibly comprehend." He let that hang in the air, a deliberate insult designed to make them squirm. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He enjoyed that. He fed on their discomfort. While he spoke, Elara was lost. She wasn't thinking about his words, not really. She was thinking about the music. She had heard that prelude before, played it 100 times in her secret practice room. She could feel the weight of the chords in her own hands, the way the melody seemed to pull at your heart. A desperate cry from a deep, lonely place. She wasn't trying to be disrespectful. In fact, it was the opposite. She was so deeply inside the music that the outside world, including Mr. Finch's lecture, had faded to a distant hum. Her fingers, resting on her lap, were gently moving, tracing the shape of the melody she heard so clearly in her head. Her face was soft, thoughtful, a stark contrast to the tense expressions around her, and that's when he saw her. His pacing stopped. His eyes, which had been sweeping over the class with practiced disdain, narrowed and locked onto her. The sudden silence in his monologue was like a vacuum, and every head in the room turned to see what had caught his attention. Elara felt the shift in the atmosphere like a drop in pressure. She blinked, pulled abruptly from her internal world back into the harsh reality of the classroom. She looked up and met his gaze. His eyes were cold and sharp like little chips of ice. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice no longer a boom but a sharp, cutting blade. The sound of her name in his mouth felt wrong, like he was tasting something unpleasant. The entire class was now staring at her. 20 pairs of eyes all at once. It was her worst nightmare come to life. She could feel a knot tightening in her stomach, a familiar, sickening feeling. She shook her head quickly, her heart starting to pound against her ribs. "No, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A small, cruel smile played on his lips. He had found his victim for the day. "No, sir?" he repeated, mimicking her quiet tone. "Oh, I see. You disagree, then? You find my analysis of this masterpiece to be lacking? You look utterly unimpressed over there, lost in your own little world. Please do share your profound insights with the rest of us. What great truth about the Russian soul have you uncovered that has escaped the rest of humanity?" A wave of heat washed over her face, so intense it felt like her skin was on fire. She could feel the blood rushing to her cheeks, a bright, undeniable blush of shame. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and into the darkness below. I wasn't," she stammered, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight, her mouth dry. He wasn't finished. He took a step closer to her desk, his shadow falling over her. "Of course not," he said, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was far worse than his anger. "How silly of me. One must have a profound connection to the instrument, a deep well of life experience, to understand such a piece. It's not merely about pressing keys. It's about translating human suffering into sound. A concept some," he paused, letting his eyes sweep over her simple clothes, her worn-out bag, might struggle to grasp. That's when it happened. A snicker from the back of the room. It was a small sound, but in the dead silence of the classroom it sounded like a gunshot. It was followed by another and then a few more. Some students tried to hide their smiles by looking down at their desks, but she could see their shoulders shaking with silent laughter. They weren't laughing at Mr. Finch, they were laughing at her. At her silence, at her stammering, at the fact that she had been singled out. Exposed as the one who didn't belong, Ilara stared down at her desk, at the neat, handwritten notes in her notebook. The words began to blur and swim together as her eyes filled with tears. She fought them back, blinking hard, refusing to let them fall. She would not give him that satisfaction. She would not give them that satisfaction. She could feel their eyes on her, a physical weight pressing down on her, crushing her. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, harder to breathe. She felt like an insect pinned to a board. Helpless and on display for everyone to see and mock, Mr. Finch had not just asked her a question. He had peeled back her skin and shown everyone the soft, vulnerable parts she worked so hard to protect. And they had all watched, and some of them had laughed. The snickers faded, but the echo of them seemed to bounce off the walls of the room, clinging to the air like a bad smell. Ilara kept her eyes fixed on her desk, on the little groove she had carved into the wood with her pen over the past semester. It was a small, imperfect line, and right now it felt like the only solid thing in the world. She could feel Mr. Finch's eyes on her, a cold, heavy weight. He was savoring this, savoring her silence, her shame. He had won, and he wanted to enjoy his victory for a moment longer. He took a step back, a thoughtful, almost theatrical look on his face. "But you know," he began, his voice shifting from the sharp blade of a moment ago to something softer, more dangerous, like the purr of a cat that has just cornered a mouse. "That is perhaps unfair of me, to talk of such things in the abstract. Music is not meant to be talked about. It is meant to be felt. It is meant to be experienced." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, and a new kind of tension began to build. The students who had been laughing were now quiet again, sensing a shift in the game. This was no longer just about mocking a quiet girl. Something else was happening. Mr. Finch turned slowly, his arm sweeping out in a grand, dramatic gesture toward the far corner of the lecture hall. There, like a sleeping beast, sat the grand piano. It was a beautiful, polished black instrument, its lid propped open, revealing the strings and hammers inside. It usually sat there silently, a piece of furniture, a symbol of the art they were all supposed to be learning. But now, under Mr. Finch's pointing finger, it looked like a throne or perhaps an altar. "Miss Vance," he said, her name once again sounding like an accusation. "Since you seem to have it all figured out in your silence, since you find my lecture so unremarkable that you can retreat into your own thoughts, perhaps you would be so kind as to enlighten us all." He smiled. But it was a thin, cruel thing that didn't reach his eyes. "Why don't you come up here and play for us?" A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck all the air out of the room. This was new. This was not part of the usual script. Mr. Finch was a bully, but he was usually a verbal bully. This was something else entirely. This was a public execution, he continued, his voice smooth and reasonable, which only made it more terrifying. "It's just the opening passage. The first 12 bars. That's all. Show the class how easy it is. Show us your interpretation. Let us feel the Russian soul that you so clearly understand." He made little quotation marks in the air with his fingers when he said the word easy, a final. Twisting of the knife, the challenge hung there, impossible and immense. It was a trap, and everyone knew it. If she refused, she would be seen as defiant, disrespectful, and admitting she couldn't do it. He would mock her for her cowardice. If she went up there and fumbled, which was the expected outcome, he would have proven his point. He would have humiliated her completely, in the most public way possible. There was no way out. Ilara felt a wave of dizziness. Her first instinct was to flee. She wanted to grab her bag, run out of the room, and never come back. She could feel the tears she had been fighting back stinging her eyes again, and she blinked furiously. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure the people next to her could hear it. Her palms were sweaty and her hands felt cold and clumsy. She was not a performer. She was a ghost. Ghosts don't play the piano for an audience. She looked up and scanned the faces of her classmates. She saw pity in some eyes, a kind of horrified sympathy. But in others, she saw that same morbid curiosity from before. They were leaning forward, waiting for the crash. This was the most exciting thing that had happened in music theory all year. They were waiting for the show. The realization was like a splash of cold water. They weren't on her side. They were just the audience dot, and then something inside her shifted. It wasn't a loud, dramatic change. It was quiet and small, like a single spark in a dark room. She thought about the piano. She thought about the late nights in the small, soundproof room, the only place in the world where she felt real. She thought about the music, how it wasn't just notes on a page to her. It was her language. It was her friend. It was the one thing that was truly hers. Mr. Finch could mock her clothes, her silence, her background, but he had no idea about the music. He was using her most sacred thing as a weapon to shame her, and in that moment a tiny flicker of anger ignited inside her. It wasn't a hot, explosive anger. It was a cold, hard, steady anger. The room was utterly silent. You could hear the hum of the lights overhead. Mr. Finch stood with his arms crossed, a look of triumphant expectation on his face. He was waiting for her to crumble. For what felt like an eternity, Ilara didn't move. She just sat there, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes looking past the teacher, past the piano, at something no one else could see. The storm was still raging inside her, the fear was still there, a churning sea of panic. But now, in the middle of that storm, there was a small, solid island of resolve. He wanted a show? He wanted to see her fail? Fine. Slowly, deliberately, she reached down and pushed her chair back. The scrape of the wooden legs against the polished floor was shockingly loud in the silence, like a clap of thunder. Every single person in the room jumped. The sound was a declaration. It was the sound of her making a choice. She stood up. Her movements were not shaky or hesitant. They were calm and measured, betraying none of the chaos she felt inside. She straightened her back, picked up her worn bag, and placed it neatly on her chair. Then she began to walk. She didn't look at Mr. Finch. She didn't look at any of her classmates. Her eyes were fixed on the piano at the front of the room. With each step, she felt the weight of their stares on her back, but it no longer felt crushing. It felt like fuel. She was walking through a fire of their judgment, and she was not burning. She was walking toward her own execution, or perhaps toward something else entirely. The distance from her desk to the piano had never seemed so long, and yet she reached it in what felt like no time at all, standing before the silent, gleaming instrument, ready to face whatever came next. The bench creaked softly as Ilara sat down, a small, insignificant sound in the vast, tense silence of the lecture hall. It was the only sound. For a moment she just sat there, her back to the room, looking at the black and white keys. They were familiar old friends. She ran her fingers lightly over them, not pressing them down, just feeling the cool, smooth ivory in the slightly worn edges. This small, simple gesture was a quiet act of defiance. She was taking her time. This was her space now, not his. She could feel the weight of every single eye on her back, a heavy, suffocating blanket of expectation and scorn. Mr. Finch was still standing by his desk, his arms crossed, a look of smug triumph on his face. He was enjoying this, savoring the final moments before her inevitable public failure. Ilara adjusted the bench, moving it a fraction of an inch forward, then back. She was finding her center, her grounding. The fear was still there, a cold not deep in her stomach, but the anger was a hot coal beside it, giving her strength. She thought of the snickers of his cruel words, of the years of feeling invisible and small. She thought of the lonely nights in the practice room, the music her only true friend. All of it was here in this room with this piano. She placed her fingers on the keys, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. She took a slow, silent breath, and then she began to play. The first notes were quiet, almost hesitant. They were soft, questioning, like a voice lost in a vast, empty space. A few students in the front row leaned forward, their expressions still cynical, waiting for the mistake. They expected a fumbled note, a wrong chord, a moment of hesitation that would prove Mr. Finch right. But the notes were correct, perfectly placed. And then something began to happen. The quiet melody started to grow, to gather strength and purpose. It was no longer just a question. It was a statement. A low, resonant chord filled the room, and the air seemed to vibrate with a new energy. The cynical expressions in the front row began to soften. Replaced by a flicker of confusion, then curiosity, the music began to unfold like a story being told for the first time. It was a story of deep, profound loneliness. The melody was a single, clear voice singing a sad, beautiful song in the middle of the storm. The notes were not just correct. They were filled with a longing that was so real, so palpable, it felt like a physical presence in the room. The students who had been leaning back in their seats, ready for the show to end, were now leaning forward, their faces rapt with attention. The smirks had completely vanished. They were no longer watching a student being forced to play. They were listening to something genuine, something raw and powerful. Then the storm hit. The music swelled, growing from a sad melody into a torrent of sound. Elara's hands, which had seemed so timid, were now flying across the keys with a ferocity and a strength that seemed impossible. The chords were huge, crashing like waves against a rocky shore. It was the sound of anger, of frustration, of a scream that had been held back for too long. This was the sound of her humiliation, her shame, her years of being overlooked. It was all pouring out of her through her fingers into the piano and filling the room with a raw, unfiltered emotion that no one there had ever experienced before. A girl in the second row slowly put her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. The boy who had snickered earlier was staring, his mouth slightly agape, his face pale, but the most dramatic change was in Mr. Finch. His smug, triumphant expression had crumbled away, piece by piece. As the music grew in intensity, the color drained from his face. His arms uncrossed and fell limply at his sides. He took an involuntary step back, as if the sound had physically pushed him. He was an expert, a man who had dedicated his life to this music, and he was hearing something he had never heard before. He was hearing the soul of the piece, the very thing he had arrogantly claimed they could never understand. And it was coming from the quiet girl in the worn-out coat, the girl he had publicly shamed. His face was a mask of shock and utter disbelief. He looked from the piano to Elara's back, as if trying to reconcile the two things in his mind. It was impossible. Elara was no longer in the room. She was lost in the music, completely consumed by it. She wasn't thinking about the notes, or her fingers, or the people watching her. She was just feeling. Every chord was a release. Every fast passage was a purge. The anger, the pain, the loneliness, it was all flowing out of her, leaving behind a strange, clear sense of peace. She was not just playing the piano. She was exorcising a ghost. The music reached its peak, a final, desperate cry that echoed the depth of human suffering, and then, as quickly as it had begun, it softened, the storm passed. The loud, crashing chords gave way to the sad, lonely melody from the beginning. But it was different now. It wasn't just sad. It was resilient. It had been through the storm and it had survived. The final notes were soft, fading away into the silence like an echo. She played the last resonant chord and let it hang in the air, vibrating, full of all the emotion she had just poured into it. And then she lifted her hands from the keys. The silence that followed was not the same silence that had been there before. It was not a tense, awkward silence. It was a heavy, profound, awe-filled silence. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the music had been so powerful that it had stolen all the sound and all the air from the room. 20 students and one teacher were frozen in place, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The only sound was the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the last note as it faded into nothingness. The silence was her final statement. It was louder than any applause, more powerful than any words. It was the sound of a room full of people being utterly and completely silenced. The silence that filled the lecture hall after the last note faded was a living thing. It was heavy and thick, pressing down on everyone, making the air hard to breathe. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full, packed to the brim, with the ghost of the music that had just been played. 21 people were frozen in place, their minds struggling to catch up with what their ears had just witnessed. The students sat motionless, their eyes wide, their bodies leaning forward as if pulled by an invisible string. Their faces, which had held a mixture of boredom, cynicism, and morbid curiosity just moments before, were now masks of pure, unadulterated awe. They had come to watch a car crash, and instead, they had seen an angel fall to earth, but the most dramatic transformation was in the man standing at the front of the room, Mr. Finch. The untouchable, the arrogant master of his domain, looked like a statue that had been cracked down the middle. The color had drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, waxy gray. His mouth was slightly open, but no words came out. His arms, which had been crossed in a display of confident control, now hung limply at his sides. He was a man who had built his entire career on the idea that he knew more, that he felt more than anyone else in the room. And in the span of a few minutes, the quiet girl he had dismissed as nothing had proven him to be a fool. She hadn't just played the notes. She had peeled back the soul of the music and laid it bare for all to see, a depth of understanding he could only lecture about, a passion he could only describe from a distance. He was a scholar of the ocean, and she had just pulled them all down into its deepest, most mysterious trenches. The spell was finally broken by a sound so small, so out of place, that it was shocking. A pen, slipped from the nerveless fingers of a boy in the front row, clattered onto the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the profound quiet. It was the catalyst that released everyone from their trance. A collective, shaky breath was drawn by the entire room. People started to move, shifting in their seats, blinking rapidly as if waking from a dream. Alara was the first to move with purpose. She gently lowered the lid of the piano, the soft thud a final, quiet period at the end of her story. The action was simple, but it was filled with a sense of finality and control. She had said what she needed to say. Then she stood up from the bench. Her back was still to the room, but she could feel the change in the atmosphere behind her. The weight of their stares was still there, but it was no longer a weight of judgment. It was a weight of reverence. She began to walk back to her desk. Every step was measured and calm. Her shoes made soft, rhythmic sounds on the polished floor, the only sound in the room besides the hum of the lights. As she passed the rows of students, she could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't look at them. She saw them in her peripheral vision, their faces turned toward her, their expressions soft and open. The girl who had put her hand over her mouth now had tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The boy who had snickered wouldn't meet her eyes, staring down at his desk as if ashamed. The walk to the piano had felt like a mile-long journey to her own execution. The walk back felt just as long, but it was different. It was a walk through a world that had been fundamentally changed, not just for them, but for her. When she reached her desk, she didn't immediately sit. She stood for a moment, looking at the worn wood, at her neat notebook, at the pen lying beside it. It was like looking at relics from another lifetime, the life she had lived just 15 minutes ago. Then she sat down, her posture straight, and folded her hands in her lap, just as she had done 1,000 times before. But everything was different. Mr. Finch finally seemed to find a fragment of his composure. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. He looked at his students, but he couldn't hold their gaze. He saw the awe on their faces, the tears, the silent respect, and he knew he had lost them. Not just for today, but forever. He was no longer the ultimate authority in the room. He was just a man who had been terribly, publicly wrong. Class is dismissed, he said, his voice unsteady, lacking all of its usual booming confidence. It was a thin, reedy sound, almost a whisper. He didn't wait for them to gather their things. He turned, walked to his desk, gathered his papers with fumbling, clumsy hands, and practically fled the room through a side door. Leaving the students to process what had happened on their own, the dismissal broke the final barrier. The students began to move, slowly at first, then with more purpose. There was no loud chatter, no excited gossip. They moved in a kind of hushed, reverent silence, packing their bags as if in a church. As they filed out of the main door, they glanced at Alara, but no one knew what to say. What could you say? Sorry I laughed? You were amazing? It all felt inadequate, insulting to the raw power of what they had just experienced. One girl, a quiet type with glasses, paused by Alara's desk. She opened her mouth, then closed it, struggling. That was... She started, then shook her head, a look of frustration on her face. That was everything. She gave Alara a small, sincere nod and then hurried out. Alara watched her go, then looked around the now empty room. The sunlight was streaming through the tall windows, making dust motes dance in the golden light. The room looked peaceful, ordinary, but she knew it would never be the same. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had been trembling with fear just a short while ago. They were still now. They felt strong. She hadn't said a single word in her own defense, but her music had spoken for her. It had screamed, it had cried, it had raged, and it had finally found peace. And in doing so, it had given her a small, quiet piece of that peace too. She was still the quiet girl in the worn-out coat, but for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, and that was more than enough.